All right, guys. So this video is going to be around kind of group selection and what each one of the groups broadly mean. So I'm sure you can kind of search up and figure out what each one of these groups does on a broad level to get a little bit more like insight. But I wanted to kind of go through each one of them and kind of give a little bit of like some tidbits, right? So the way that I actually have these ordered is very subjective. So don't get don't get angry with me, but I would say that this is like the most technical down to the least, right? Going this way, right? Now, is, for example, healthcare or is like industrials way more technical than consumer retail? Maybe, maybe not, right? I mean, this is like my personal like opinion based on what I have heard and from folks that I have spoken to. But I would say like directionally, it is relatively correct, right? So let's go through it line by line and kind of talk about each one of these groups, right? So the first group is actually pretty unique, and that is restructuring, right? Restructuring, you kind of have to know that you want to do restructuring very, very, very early because you have to be prepped with basically all of the investment banking material. And then on top of that, you have to prep for like the restructuring material as well. So I recruited for restructuring in a couple of banks, but I mean it's not it's pretty rare for you to kind of get into restructuring if you don't have some form of a restructuring background, at least like pre-MBA, right? The next group is M&A. M&A is meant to be relatively like general, meaning that you get to work across like multiple industries. This typically has the longest hours. It typically is the most like the quantitative of like the overall groups as well. And yeah, it tends to be like a little bit more like the hardo like kind of grind culture as well, right? So these two are what we call like product groups, right? So notice how in each one of these, it's not like you're working in a particular industry, right? You might work across like different industries, but yeah, so you get a little bit more like a generalist experience, but you're not like tied down to a specific industry if you're interested in like tech, for example, right? That's why I have the line there. So the next one is TMT. Now this stands for Technology, Media, and Telecom. Some banks will have this split up. Some banks will have this like all in one team. So they might have a technology team, and then they might have a separate like media and communications team or a media and telecom team. So make sure that you know what that bank has before you kind of recruit at it. Right. FIG stands for Financial Institutions Group. So that covers banks, specialty finance, typically insurance, and also fintech at a lot of banks. So if you want to recruit for fintech, make sure that you're recruiting at the right place, right? You're not telling a TMT team that you want to recruit for fintech, and that's actually under their FIG group. And the reason why I would say TMT is relatively high in the like overall technical ranking is because it has really high demand. On top of that, FIG, it has kind of some nuances to the modeling, right? They don't do the typical types of models and the typical types of um, how can I put it without making it sound technical? Like they value companies in a different way because they're valuing banks, and banks are in the business of debt, right? So that's why it ends up being a little bit more technical. Regal is real estate, gaming, and lodging. Um, Also a great group. Financial Sponsors Group is typically working with fulfilling mandates with private equity firms. Both of these, I mean, they typically are smaller groups than FIG, TMT, and all the rest. But yeah, they a lot of people love them and end up in really good seats there. Energy, now this can vary quite a bit, and this is quite broad, right? Some banks have like an oil and gas group. Some banks have like a combined energy group. Some banks might have like a utilities, um, like a vertical within it. A vertical is basically like an internal team within one of these larger groups. So a vertical example would be like technology within TMT, right? Or media within TMT, or insurance companies within FIG, right? So energy, make sure that you understand what the energy group looks like, what groups that they have or verticals they have within energy. And then healthcare, I've heard is relatively generalist experience overall across healthcare, which is great. And then this is industrials, and then there's consumer and retail, right? So that's kind of like a high level of all the groups overall. I would say do more research around what exactly they work on. Like for example, what exactly is a particular bank that has a group in industrials? What are some maybe deals that they've worked on, right? And see if that stuff seems interesting to you. Now, in terms of like how I would go about like selecting these groups, so I would say your first choice should always be what you want, right? Remember, like if you're kind of thinking about this and you're in an MBA program recruiting for investment banking, you're kind of using up your like one big career switch. And if you're using up that one big career switch, you want to be in one of the groups that you actually want to work in, right? So let's say that you have a tech background, but you really want to work in real estate, right? Well, spin some story around why you want to actually work in real estate, right? You need to have a solid story around like, okay, what is your interest in real estate, and spend a little bit of time and kind of like soul searching, trying to figure out like which industry you actually want to work in, right? Because even after you get hired, hopefully, full time, it is pretty difficult to transition from like energy to healthcare, or from like healthcare to TMT, right? So I would definitely say like have the first choice as like what you want, right? And I would have a second choice pick as well. So for every single bank, you need to have I would actually recommend having three picks, and I'll talk about like why in specific in a second. But I would have your second choice around your background, right? So if you have, for example, a background as a software engineer, well, it kind of makes sense that you would recruit for TMT, right? And if that's what you're interested in, great, right? Then you have more flexibility with your second choice. But let's say that you're a software engineer that's really interested in real estate, then your first can be real estate, gaming, and lodging, and the second could be TMT, right? So that's kind of the way that I think about a second choice, and then I would also kind of have a third choice selected. And the reason for that is like, let's say that you want to have a generalist experience and you want something that's quite quantitative, and that's really important to you. Well, you might say that your first choice is M&A, and then you had a background in tech, right? So you choose TMT as your second group, right? Well, for example, Goldman Sachs does not have an M&A team. They only have uh, coverage teams, right? So if you go up to a Goldman Sachs banker and you say, "Hey, I'm interested in M&A as my first choice and TMT as my second choice," well, it depends on how nice they are, right? But they might just look at you and be like, "Well, this guy doesn't know like the first thing about Goldman Sachs because he doesn't know that we don't recruit people for an M&A team at the associate at like the summer associate level, right?" So just make sure that that's not a mistake that you make. So I would have a third choice, and then if this is something that I would only recommend if you feel like you're really ahead of the game at this point in time, right? If you have your like the five questions like the five big behavioral questions prepped, if you feel pretty decent on like your technicals as well, then I would kind of venture into looking at, if you don't really care about which one of these that you work at, specific banks are better at specific groups, right? So, for example, the consumer retail team at Lazard is really well known, right? And I can make more videos around like which banks are really well known for which, or you can kind of do a bit of your own research there as well. But if you're recruiting at a particular bank, let's say Lazard, right, and you don't really care about like which kind of coverage group you work at, well, maybe recruit for consumer retail, right? That's the group that they're most well known for. Or maybe don't recruit for consumer retail because that's the group that's probably going to be the most competitive, right? So that's another way to kind of think through it. But I would make sure that you're pretty solid on your behaviorals, you're really solid on your technicals first, because that's way more important than throwing in a fourth, fifth, sixth group in there, right? And then on top of that, I would say um, just as like a last thing, remember that for each one of these groups, you're going to have to prep a deal and a industry trend, right? So if you tell someone that you're interested in the financial sponsors group, well, make sure that you have a deal and an industry trend around that prepped already, because they're definitely going to ask you about that as well, right? So that's a super high level around like how I would go about like doing the group selection process. I would say do this as early as possible, so that you kind of you go into the process knowing exactly what you want, how you're recruiting at each one of the banks, right? Because you don't want to start the coffee chat process and you're still undecided between like four groups, right? And that could lead to you being in a situation that is less than ideal. So that's essentially how I'd go about group selection. So I hope that's been helpful.